The coffee was lukewarm, which felt appropriate. I'm sitting at my kitchen table at 7:15 in the morning, still in yesterday's socks, staring at a piece of paper that had been taped, not mailed, taped, to my front door sometime between midnight and sunrise. The paper was cream-colored, embossed with the Maplewood Estates HOA seal, which appeared to be a little house inside a laurel wreath, as if the founding members had confused a homeowners association with the Roman Senate. The notice read, in 14-point Times New Roman, that my front garden was in violation of Article 7, Section 3, Subsection C of the Maplewood Estates Community Covenant, which governed the maintenance and aesthetic presentation of residential landscaping visible from common areas or public thoroughfares. I read it twice. Then I drank the rest of my coffee, or then I read it a third time to make sure I hadn't hallucinated it. My garden was, by any reasonable standard, fine. I had 3 rose bushes along the front fence, a pair of boxwood shrubs flanking the front walk, 2 juniper topiaries I'd shaped myself, and a small raised bed of lavender that my neighbor Marcus had once described as aggressively pleasant. The rose bushes had gotten a little long in the outermost branches, maybe 6-8 inches past what you'd call manicured, because I'd had a rough month at work and trimming rose bushes had not made the list. I am one person. The list is long. The notice did not specify what was wrong. It cited the subsection. It offered the phrase, overgrown and inconsistent with community standards, and informed me that I had 14 days to bring the property into compliance before the HOA would pursue remedial action and associated fines. It was signed, in handwriting so precise it bordered on architectural, by Sandra Holloway, President, Maplewood Estates HOA. I had never spoken to Sandra Holloway, but I had seen her. Everyone had seen her. She appeared at her property line most mornings between 8 and 9, wearing pressed khaki slacks, a polo shirt in a color that could only be described as aspirational beige, and a sun visor with the Maplewood Estates logo embroidered above the brim. She carried a clipboard. Not a tablet, not a phone. A physical clipboard, the kind with a spring clamp at the top, and it loaded with what I could only assume were documents pertaining to the suffering of others. Her hair was set in a style I would call suburban Roman helmet, a rigid, dark brown arc that sat above her forehead without movement, as though it had been lacquered into submission each morning and knew better than to argue. She wore pearl earrings regardless of the hour, including, according to my neighbor Deb, 7 a.m. on a Sunday during a rainstorm. Sandra's first words to me, delivered over my fence 3 days after the notice, established everything I needed to know about her. "A community," she said, looking at my rose bushes the way a surgeon looks at a tumor, "is only as presentable as its least presentable member." She let that sit for a moment, clipboard pressed to her chest. I told her I'd look into trimming the bushes when I had a chance this weekend. "This weekend," she repeated, and wrote something on her clipboard. Just wrote it, while making eye contact, like a cop writing a ticket for jaywalking in front of a school of nuns. I went inside. I opened a beer. It was 10:45 in the morning. The circumstances, I felt, justified it. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I am not a difficult person. I paid my HOA dues on time, every quarter, for 6 years. I attended 2 of their annual meetings, which is 2 more than most people can claim without medication. I did not park on the street overnight. I did not install a basketball hoop. I once spent 40 minutes repositioning my garbage cans because the angle was, apparently, 2 degrees off parallel with the curb. And Sandra had mentioned it in passing with the tone of someone describing a war crime. I did all of this because I believed in the basic social contract of not being a nuisance to the people you live near. What I did not believe in was Sandra Holloway deciding that a few long rosebush canes constituted an aesthetic emergency. I trimmed the roses that Saturday. Spent an hour and a half out there with proper pruning shears, cleaning cuts, the works. I took a photo when I finished, because some part of my nervous system had apparently decided to start documenting things, which in retrospect was excellent instinct. Sunday morning, new notice on the door. This one cited the junipers. Inconsistent vertical shaping. That was the exact phrase. The junipers I had shaped myself, by hand, over the course of 2 weekends the previous autumn, which were guilty of inconsistent vertical shaping. I stood in my doorway for a moment, reading this, in the same way you stand very still when you hear a noise downstairs and aren't sure yet what it is. I went inside. I ate cereal. I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, which is where I do my clearest thinking, and I stared at the refrigerator, and I thought about the word inconsistent. I called my brother-in-law Marcus because Marcus is a former landscaper, currently a general contractor, and approaches all bureaucratic obstruction with the same energy a golden retriever approaches a closed gate, cheerfully, persistently, and with complete conviction that it will open eventually. "Send me the notice," he said. I sent it. "Inconsistent vertical shaping," he read aloud, ours in the voice of a man reviewing evidence at a tribunal. "What does that even? Your junipers are fine, Logan. I've seen your junipers." "I know." "Do you want me to come over and take measurements? I have a level." I told him I'd let him know. I called the HOA management company that Monday. They were sympathetic in the way that people who have no power are sympathetic, generously and without consequence. The compliance officer, a man named Terry, who sounded like he was eating a sandwich, told me that the notices were issued at the discretion of the HOA president, and that he really didn't have the authority to override them. I asked what would constitute compliance, specifically for the junipers. Terry said he'd have to refer that to the board. I asked when the board met. He said every third Tuesday. I thanked him and hung up. I went back to the kitchen floor. I took out a notepad. I wrote inconsistent vertical shaping at the top and stared at it for a long time. Then I opened my laptop and started reading the Maplewood Estates Community Covenant, all 47 pages of it, which I had never done before because I had always assumed it was a normal document written by normal people. I want to be very clear that I was wrong about this. The covenant was written in 1987 by a man named Gerald Fitch, who had apparently approached the task of governing a 40-unit residential community with the ambition of a man who had always suspected he should have been a judge. It covered everything: fence heights, mailbox specifications, approved exterior paint palettes, holiday decoration deadlines, and, buried on page 31, you're under a subsection titled Vegetative Presentation Standards, a clause that I read 3 times and then wrote down in capital letters. Article 7, Section 3, Subsection F, vegetative screening, topiaries, or shaped plantings intended as ornamental features may be maintained in any form, provided such forms do not obstruct sight lines to neighboring structures, do not encroach upon common area, and are maintained with consistent, ongoing upkeep. Any form. Any form. I closed the laptop. I ate the rest of my cereal, which had gone completely soft, and I did not mind at all. Any form did not mean compliant hedges. It did not mean tasteful spheres or HOA-approved cones. It meant any form. Gerald Fitch, in 1987, had written a covenant so permissive on the subject of topiary that it had functionally invited anything I could imagine, provided I maintained it consistently and didn't block Sandra's view of whatever Sandra felt entitled to view. I thought about this for about 48 hours. I ate some toast, I went to work, I came home, I sat on the back porch, which is where I go when I've already made a decision but haven't admitted it yet. I drank a beer and watched the sun go down behind the junipers, and I thought about dragons. Not because dragons were the first thing that came to mind. I'd considered lions, eagles. A bear would have been funny. But there were 2 junipers, and they flanked the front walk. And if you were coming to my door, they would be the first things you saw, and I kept returning to the image of two large, anatomically considered dragon topiaries, 12 feet apart, wings raised, heads angled toward whoever was approaching, or with the particular expression of animals who have been told they are inconsistently vertical and find this personally insulting. I finished the beer. I went inside. I found, after 40 minutes of searching, a topiary artist in the next county named Victor Sabo, whose website included photos of a horse, a peacock, a life-size giraffe he'd installed for a hotel lobby in Columbus, and what appeared to be a rendering of the Loch Ness Monster emerging from a backyard koi pond. His tagline was, "Where plants go to become legends." I sent him an email at 11:15 at night that probably read with more enthusiasm than I'd intended. He called me the next morning. "Dragons," he said. "Yes. 2 of them. Both of them." "Junipers, you said?" The junipers I'd already shaped. I told him their current height, their width, their approximate density. To which there was a pause. The kind of pause a craftsman makes when he's looking at dimensions in his head. "I can work with that," Victor said. "I'm going to need 3 days, my own tools, and you need to understand that once I start, there's a particular point of commitment where the bush looks completely insane before it looks like a dragon." I told him I understood completely. "Most homeowners panic at that point." I said I was not most homeowners. Another pause. Shorter this time. "I'll be there Thursday," he said. Marcus showed up Wednesday evening with a 6-pack and an expression of deep professional admiration when I told him the plan. He is a large man, Marcus, 6'3", built like someone who's been moving things for a living since age 17, with hands that look like they could tighten bolts through sheer authority. He has a scar above his left eyebrow from an incident he describes only as a disagreement with a circular saw and a ponytail that he has worn since 1998, and which no one, in all that time, has questioned. He sat down in my kitchen, twisted open a beer, and said, with the certainty of a man announcing a weather forecast, "This is going to be the best thing that has ever happened to this neighborhood." I told him I hoped it resolved the situation. "Logan," he said, "Buddy, this is not going to resolve the situation. This is going to escalate the situation to a level that cannot be de-escalated, and that is correct. That is the right call." He looked genuinely moved. I asked him if he wanted to be here Thursday and Friday while Victor worked. "I have blocked my schedule," he said, even though I hadn't asked yet. I moved 2 client meetings. I told my wife I had a job in the area. She knows I'm lying, but she finds you charming, so we're fine." Marcus's wife, Gloria, has never once in 6 years of knowing her shown any sign of finding me charming, but I appreciated the gesture. Victor arrived Thursday at 8 in the morning in a white van with Szabo Artistic Landscapes stenciled on the side and a collection of hand tools in the back that looked like they belonged to someone who took their work very seriously and slightly personally. He was shorter than his phone presence had suggested. Maybe 5'8", compact, with wire-rimmed glasses and the focused, patient expression of a man who has carved a giraffe out of a hedge and remained calm throughout. He walked up to my junipers, put his hands in his pockets, and stood there for 4 full minutes without speaking. Marcus, standing on the porch with his coffee, watched him with the reverence of a man observing a priest. "Lot of mass in the lower third," Victor finally said, to no one in particular. "We'll start with the neck." He opened his van. What followed was, and I mean this with complete admiration, the most methodical, unhurried act of arboricultural violence I have ever witnessed. Victor removed branches the way a sculptor removes marble, not hacking, but finding. He would study the plant for 30 seconds, then make 1 cut, sometimes 2. Then he'd step back and look again. He wore knee pads. He talked to himself occasionally in Hungarian, which Marcus later said sounded like an argument with the universe that Victor was slowly winning. I should describe, in fairness, us what the junipers looked like midway through day 1, because Victor had warned me, and I want to note for the record that I did not panic. They looked like the aftermath of something. The right side juniper had lost its entire upper third, and the remaining structure looked less like a topiary and more like evidence. I brought Victor a sandwich at noon. He thanked me without looking up, took one bite, set it on the van bumper, and didn't touch it again for 2 hours. Marcus ate his own lunch on the porch steps, watching, and at one point said softly and to himself, "This man is an artist," with the specific gravity of someone who does not say that lightly. By end of day 1, there were shapes. Rough, gestural, but unambiguous. The left juniper had the beginning of a neck and the suggestion of a raised head. On the right had a wingspan emerging from the upper crown that was recognizably a wing in the same way a rough draft is recognizably a story. Victor covered them with tarps when he left, which felt both professional and theatrical. Sandra drove past twice. I know because Marcus was watching. "She slowed down," he said. "Both times. The second time she stopped for probably 6 seconds, and then kept going." I said nothing. I went inside and made dinner. Day 2 was where it became real. Victor arrived at 7:45, pulled off the tarps, and spent 20 minutes just looking. Then he picked up a tool I cannot name. It was somewhere between a chisel and a very aggressive comb. And he worked for 7 hours without a break, except for coffee. By noon, the left juniper was unambiguously a dragon. Not suggestively, not abstractly, but a dragon. Neck curved in that particular S shape that says I am aware you are approaching, and I have decided how I feel about it. Head cocked slightly, mouth suggesting something between a smile and a threat, one foreleg reaching forward. The right juniper was a wingspan, a body, a tail curling at the base that spiraled around the lower trunk, with a specificity that struck me as almost arrogant. By 3 in the afternoon, Victor had added texture. Scale impressions worked into the body with a tool that vibrated slightly, and which he used with the precision of a surgeon and the expression of someone solving a crossword. The dragons were identical in posture and opposite in facing, both angled inward toward whoever approached the front walk, their bodies suggesting the word, "Why are you here?" In the most polite possible way, I stood at the end of the front path and looked at them. Marcus came and stood next to me. For a moment, neither of us said anything. "Logan," he said finally. "Yeah. These dragons are going to make Sandra Holloway cry." I said I just hoped they were in compliance with the covenant. He looked at me like I'd said something beautiful. Victor had a 3rd day of detail work and finishing, and by Friday afternoon the 2 junipers were, without any exaggeration, the finest pieces of living sculpture I had seen outside of a professional garden exhibition. They were approximately 8 feet tall at the highest point of the raised heads, with wingspans extending another 3 feet on each side. Their scale texture caught afternoon light. Their tails swept the lower hedge line. They were, in every measurable sense, I maintained with consistent and ongoing upkeep, in a form entirely of my choosing, in full compliance with Article 7, Section 3, Subsection F of the Maplewood Estates Community Covenant. Victor packed his van. I paid him, which was not cheap, and which I do not regret for a single moment. He shook my hand and said, without particular ceremony, "They'll need shaping every 4 months. Don't let anyone touch them with machine shears." I said I wouldn't. He got in the van, and then he paused and leaned out the window. "I've done a lot of these," he said. "That's the best pair I've ever made." He drove away. I stood in the driveway in the September afternoon, looking at two 8-foot dragons flanking my front walk, their heads lowered slightly in the direction of anyone who might be approaching with a clipboard. And I felt something I can only describe as architectural satisfaction. Marcus had been sitting on the porch steps the whole time. He finished his beer. He set the bottle down. "I need to make a call," he said. I asked who he was calling. "Everyone," he said. He was not exaggerating. By Saturday morning, there were 4 people I did not know standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, looking at the dragons. One of them took a photo. 2 of them were pointing. One, a man in a North Face jacket, who I later learned lived 3 streets over, said, loud enough for me to hear from the porch, "Those are extraordinary." My neighbor Deb, who is 71 and has lived in Maplewood Estates since Gerald Fitch was still alive and presumably still writing subsections, came out of her house in a housecoat and slippers, walked to the edge of my front path, looked at both dragons for a long time, and said, "Well, that's something." She went back inside and returned 10 minutes later with a folding lawn chair, a thermos, and what appeared to be a morning crossword. She positioned the chair at an angle that offered full visibility of both my front walk and the street. She unscrewed her thermos with the unhurried decisiveness of a woman who expected to be here for a while. I brought her a muffin. She accepted it without comment. Sandra Holloway appeared at 10:43. I know the exact time because I had, by this point, sat down on the porch with my own coffee and was doing nothing but waiting. The way you wait at a dentist office, but with considerably better scenery. She came around the corner of Magnolia Drive at her standard morning pace, clipboard in hand, visor in place, pearl earrings catching the morning light. And she was looking down at her clipboard when she turned onto my block, and I watched the exact moment her peripheral vision registered that something was different. She stopped. She looked up. For approximately 3 seconds, Sandra Holloway stood completely still on the sidewalk in front of my house, looking at 2 8-foot-tall dragon topiaries, and her face went through a sequence of expressions I can only describe as a controlled demolition in slow motion. There was first the blankness of non-comprehension, then recognition, then something that briefly resembled the face a person makes when they step off a curb they didn't see. Then her jaw set, and she walked forward. "What?" she said, stopping at the edge of my front path. "Is this?" It was not a question, technically. It was more of a statement that had lost confidence in itself halfway through. I said they were topiaries. "These are not topiaries." I said they were shaped plantings maintained as ornamental features, which was the exact language of Article 7, Section 3, Subsection F, which I recited from memory at a normal conversational volume while looking slightly past her left shoulder. She opened her mouth. She closed it. Deb, from her lawn chair, took a slow sip of her thermos. "These are not consistent with community standards," Sandra said. I asked her which community standards specifically, because I had read the covenant, and any form was the language Gerald Fitch had used, and I had the document inside if she'd like to review it together. Her clipboard hand tightened. These are dragons, Logan." I agreed that they were. "You put dragons in your front garden." I said I had commissioned them. Yes. She wrote something on her clipboard. She wrote it for a long time, which was slightly alarming because there couldn't have been that much to write, and I began to suspect she was just pressing the pen into the paper repeatedly. "You will be receiving a formal notice," she said. I said I looked forward to it. She left. Not quickly. Sandra was not a person who left quickly, because leaving quickly would have implied that something had affected her, but with a precision of stride that communicated, to anyone watching, that she was not done. Deb watched her go with the serene expression of someone at a garden party who has just seen the entertainment arrive. "Coker, she'll be back," Deb said. I said I was counting on it. She was back Monday morning with Terrence Blum, the HOA's vice president, who was a retired insurance adjuster and who approached every situation as though he might need to file a report on it. Terrence was a narrow man with a thin mustache and the specific energy of someone who has spent 30 years in a career that required him to explain things to people who didn't want to hear them. He looked at the dragons with the expression of a man doing math. "Are those—" he started. I said yes. He looked at Sandra. Sandra's jaw was doing the thing where it moved slightly without producing words. "Article 7, Section 3, Subsection F," I said before anyone asked. Terrence took out his phone and appeared to be finding the document. He read it. He read it again. And then he looked at Sandra with an expression that I can only characterize as apologetic in advance. "Marlene," he started, and then stopped because Sandra's name was not Marlene, and he knew that, and she knew that, and the only explanation was that in this moment the wrong name had appeared in his mouth, and he'd said it before he could stop it, which was a very human thing to do, and which Sandra visibly did not appreciate. "Sandra," he corrected. "The language does appear to be—" "I know what the language says," she said, in a tone that suggested she had very recently discovered what the language said and was furious about it in a way that had nowhere to go. They conferred on the sidewalk. I watched from the porch. Deb, who had reappeared with her lawn chair, observed both the conference and me in alternating glances with the calm interest of someone watching two televisions. Then Sandra said something she didn't realize I could hear. She'd turned away from Terrence, looking at the dragons, her back slightly toward the street, and she said, in a lower register, with the unguarded tiredness of someone who stopped performing for just a moment, "This neighborhood used to be worth something." The sentence landed in the quiet of a Monday morning with a particular weight. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I sat on the porch with my coffee, which had gone slightly cold, and I looked at the side of Sandra Holloway's face, and I thought about 6 years of quarterly dues and repositioned garbage cans and 47 pages of a covenant written by a man named Gerald, and I thought about worth something, and what it meant, and who got to decide what a neighborhood was worth, and whether my garden, my fine, previously unremarkable, now extraordinarily well-sculpted garden, had somehow caused the neighborhood to become worth less, or whether Sandra Holloway had simply looked at her street one morning and decided it wasn't reflecting the right things back at her. I didn't say any of this. I drank the rest of my cold coffee. I just got quieter. The formal notice arrived Tuesday afternoon. It cited the dragons as not in keeping with the decorative norms established by community aesthetic standards, and referenced not subsection F, but subsection A of Article 7, Section 3, which pertained to structures, fixtures, or installations that materially alter the visual character of a property. The notice had clearly been written with input from someone, possibly Terrence, who had spent time looking for a different legal hook. The problem, and I discovered this problem the same evening I discovered subsection F, was that the 1987 covenant very specifically defined structures, fixtures, or installations as non-vegetative additions, meaning fences, sheds, planters, statuary, trellises, not plants, not shaped plants, not junipers that had been encouraged by a professional to express themselves in a directional and reptilian manner. I called the HOA management company. I got Terry again. He did not sound like he was eating a sandwich this time. He sounded like a man who had recently been in several meetings he hadn't enjoyed. I walked him through subsection F. I walked him through the definition section on page 9, where structure and vegetative feature were explicitly differentiated. Terry went quiet for a moment, then said, in the voice of a man who has just understood that someone else's problem is now also his problem, "I'll need to put this to the board." I said that was fine. The board met every third Tuesday. I thanked him and hung up. Then I called Marcus. "They're trying Subsection A," I said. "Does Subsection A apply to plants?" "No." "How long have you known that?" "About 20 minutes. "Logan," he said, with something like pride, "you beautiful boring person." The board meeting was 17 days later, which gave Sandra Holloway 17 days to take actions that I would classify, generously, as creative. Day 5. She filed a noise complaint, alleging that Victor's tools had generated unreasonable sound during the work. The complaint was filed 12 days after the work was completed, which is one of those logistical details that complicates a complaint considerably. Day 9. She appeared at my door at 7:30 a.m. with a printout of a survey she had apparently commissioned, suggesting that my junipers may have root systems encroaching on the common green area 7 feet from my property line. She presented this with the confidence of a person unveiling a discovery. I mentioned, gently, that the covenant's procedure for root encroachment claims required 30 days written notice and an independent arborist's assessment, and that the HOA, under Section 12, was responsible for the cost of the independent assessment. She looked at the printout. She looked at me. She took the printout back and left. Day 11. Marcus called me at 6 in the morning. "Sandra Holloway," he said, "just knocked on my door." Marcus lives 4 streets over. She said she was doing a community wellness check. I asked what that meant. "I have no idea. I told her I was fine. She asked if I'd been spending a lot of time at your property. I said yes. She wrote something down." "Logan, I genuinely cannot tell you what she thinks this accomplishes." I said I wasn't sure either. "Also," he said, "she was wearing the visor. At 6 a.m., it's overcast." The board meeting was on a Tuesday. I arrived with a printed copy of the covenant, tabbed, with the relevant sections highlighted in 3 colors that corresponded to a legend I'd put at the top. This was, I will admit, with slightly more preparation than the situation required. But I had, at this point, developed opinions about the situation. The board met in the community room of the clubhouse, which was decorated with the specific energy of a room that had been furnished in 1994 and not looked at since. There was a long folding table, 6 chairs, water in a plastic pitcher, and a wall calendar advertising a local insurance agency that had probably closed. Sandra sat at the center of the table, clipboard in front of her, pearls in place. Terrence was to her left. The other 4 board members had the expressions of people who had genuinely not expected their HOA tenure to arrive here. There were also, in the seats behind mine, 9 other residents of Maplewood Estates, which I had not anticipated. I turned around. Deb was in the 2nd row with her thermos. 3 people I recognized from the sidewalk the previous Saturday were present. 2 others I didn't know. Marcus was in the back row, arms crossed, looking like security. I had not told any of them about the meeting. Deb, catching my eye, gave a small nod, the kind of nod a commanding officer gives when the troops are in position. The meeting was called to order. Sandra presented the HOA's position with the composed aggression of a woman who has been rehearsing. She cited the visual disruption. She cited an anonymous resident survey, which, under questioning from one of the board members, turned out to have been conducted by Sandra herself, by phone, with 3 respondents. She used the phrase, "character of the community," 4 times, 4. She described the dragons as frankly unsettling, which was the first genuinely subjective thing I'd heard her say out loud, and which told me more than the preceding 10 minutes. I presented the covenant language. I presented the definition section. I presented the distinction between vegetative features and structures. I presented, for reasons that will become clear, a photograph I'd taken of Sandra's own front garden 3 years ago, which featured a row of conical leyland cypress trees that, under measurement, exceeded the height restriction in Subsection B by approximately 14 inches. This photograph had been taken from the sidewalk, which is a public thoroughfare, and was therefore, under the covenant's own documentation standards, legitimate evidence. Terrence looked at the photograph for a long time. But one of the other board members, a woman named Patrice, who had not said a word until this moment, leaned forward and said, with the flat neutrality of someone who has decided to be accurate, "Our trees are also over height, Ted." Terrence, whose name wasn't Ted, looked at her. "Our front trees," she said. "The Leyland cypresses. They're over 14. B." There was a silence of the very specific kind that happens when people in authority realize that the territory they've been fighting over turns out to be poorly mapped. Sandra set her pen down. "That's not," she started. "The issue before the board." "The issue before the board," I said at a normal volume, "is whether the vegetative features on my property violate any enforceable covenant provision. They don't. The next issue, should the board wish to pursue it, is whether selective enforcement of the covenant against one resident, while violations by board members' own properties go unaddressed, constitutes preferential treatment under Section 22, which it does. I had found Section 22 on page 38 at 1:17 a.m., eating crackers on the kitchen floor. Sandra's hand had found the clipboard. She was holding it the way a person holds a handrail. "I'd like to move that the notice issued to my property be formally withdrawn," I said. "I'd also like to note that I'm happy to let the dragon situation and the cypress situation remain as they are, which is to say, in place, legal, and not discussed again." The board took 6 minutes to vote, 5-1 in favor of withdrawing the notice. The one was Sandra. What happened next was not something I planned, and I want to say clearly that Marcus did not tell me he was going to do it. He had, at some point during the meeting, while I was presenting covenant sections, and Sandra was building toward the expression of someone whose carefully laid plans have been taken outside and shot, quietly taken out his phone and sent a text to Gloria, who had been sitting in the parking lot. Gloria arrived at the meeting room door during the vote, carrying, with the confidence of a woman who has decided something and will not be discussing it, a 4-foot-tall yard stake sign that read, in bright green letters on a white background, "Dragon Gardens, Maplewood's finest topiary." Below this, there was a small watercolor illustration of a dragon. Not one of my dragons specifically, just a dragon, in general. She had made this sign, at home, in advance, or before knowing the outcome of the meeting. I asked her about this later, and she said, "Marcus said to be ready." And when I pointed out that we hadn't known we'd win, she looked at me with the calm of a woman who had already decided, and said, "I was ready either way." She planted the sign in the community room's small exterior flower bed, while the board was still counting votes. Sandra watched this through the window. Her face went through several phases. There was disbelief. Then the very specific tightening around the eyes of a person who has been publicly contradicted by a yard sign. Then she stood up, and her chair made a sound against the linoleum that was louder than she'd intended, and she crossed to the window, and she stood with her back to the room for a moment, looking at Gloria in the parking lot, and the sign, and the people who had started to gather near it, and Deb, who had apparently followed everyone outside and positioned her lawn chair adjacent to the flower bed, with the unhurried certainty of a woman claiming territory. "This is," Sandra started. She turned around. Her clipboard was still in her hand. The pearl earrings were still perfectly level. But there was something happening in her upper chest, something that looked like controlled breathing that had started to lose the controlling part. "This is exactly what I've been—" She gestured at the window with the clipboard. The plastic spring clamp at the top caught the light. "This community," she said to the room in general, used to have standards. It still does, Patrice said mildly. Morris Logan's in compliance. Sandra turned to Patrice with the expression of a person who has found an unexpected combatant in the wrong corner. His front garden has 8-foot dragons, Sandra said, and her voice had risen to a register I would not call shouting, but which was clearly no longer the voice she used when she thought she was winning. They're 9 feet now, said one of the residents in the back. He measured yesterday. I had, in fact, not measured them yesterday, but I appreciated the contribution. Sandra set the clipboard on the table. This was the moment, I want to describe this accurately, when everyone in the room understood that something structural had shifted, not because of the clipboard, but because Sandra Holloway had never, in any context I had observed or been described, put the clipboard down voluntarily. It was like watching a soldier lay down a weapon, except the soldier looked furious about it and was staring at a folding table as though she expected it to apologize. She walked to the door. Fine, she said, just fine. She pulled the door open, and she stepped out. And she walked toward the parking lot, and I watched through the window as she processed the lawn chair, the thermos, the sign, and the small cluster of residents who had gathered around Gloria, several of whom appeared to be taking photos of the sign. One of whom, I am not inventing this, had begun applauding slowly and without apparent irony. Sandra's stride broke. Not completely. But she missed a step, just one, on the parking lot asphalt, and her visor tilted 2 degrees to the left, and she put a hand up to correct it, and then her clipboard fell, or she'd had it tucked under her arm when she left, and it hit the pavement with a flat plastic and paper sound, and her papers, there were a lot of papers, fanned across the parking lot asphalt in the September wind, some of them skidding, some of them lifting. She stood for a moment, looking at her papers. Then she crouched in her pressed khakis and her aspirational beige polo, and she started collecting them, and the wind was not cooperating, and one of the pages skittered under a parked car, and she had to get lower than she had probably planned to get in a semi-public setting, and her helmet hair held, because it always held, it was engineered to hold, but her expression had crossed from controlled into something else entirely. Something that looked like the exhaustion of a person who has been maintaining a performance for so long, they've forgotten the performance requires an audience. Deb, from her lawn chair, watched all of this with the unhurried attention of a naturalist observing an interesting but unsurprising event. She had her thermos. She did not move. At one point she picked up her crossword and wrote something down without breaking her observation of Sandra. Gloria retrieved one of the escaped papers from under the far car and brought it back. She extended it politely. Sandra took it without making eye contact. Marcus had come to stand beside me in the community room doorway. I didn't plan the sign, he said. I said I'd gathered that. Gloria made it Thursday. She said you'd need something for after. I looked at my brother-in-law. Or she wants to sell them, he added. To the neighbors, $10 each. I went home through the back of the parking lot. I didn't say anything to Sandra, or to the small crowd, or to Deb, who gave me a minimal, satisfied nod as I passed. I walked around the corner down Magnolia Drive and up my front path between the 2 dragons, who caught the late afternoon light along their scale impression flanks and looked exactly as they had always looked, attentive, patient, and entirely unbothered. I went around to the back porch. I sat in the chair that's angled toward the fence, the one I use when I've already finished something and am just occupying the aftermath. I opened a beer. The afternoon had the specific quiet of a Tuesday that has been more eventful than Tuesday usually manages. The air smelled like lavender from the front bed, which Marcus had once described as aggressively pleasant, which it was. From somewhere down the block, I could hear a car starting. Then nothing. I had not received a covenant violation in 14 days. I did not expect to receive one tomorrow. Sandra Holloway would be president of the Maplewood Estates HOA until the annual election in February, which was 4 months away, and the candidates had not yet been announced, and I had not been thinking about this. I took a long drink of beer and looked at the fence, which needed a coat of stain on the lower boards where the paint had started to peel, which was a project for October probably, maybe November, and which I noted without urgency. The dragons were at the front of the house. I couldn't see them from here, but I knew they were there,